Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this call today of the launch of a new Mission Zero Coalition paper, which is called Lessons from the Past Towards a Better Future. And this paper, it comes in two parts. Essentially, it comes out of some work that I took forward as a senior fellow at the Mosfer Ramley Centre for Business and Government over the past 2 years, which was actually to produce a summary digest paper of what has happened at every single COP from COPs 1 to 27. I found actually looking at climate literature often you have to throw yourself in at the deep end, and for the sort of trepid sort of beginner who wanting to come to terms with not just what happens at the Conference of Parties, as they're so termed, but to understand what has evolved over the past 27 years, I thought it would be helpful to put into a sort of single document, a chronicle of what's gone on, what have been the reactions to COPs, what have been the key negotiations that have taken place. And I'm incredibly grateful for my co-author, Will Farrell, who will be also speaking as part of this launch today. But the paper, it was also sort of looks ahead of COP28, at where we go next. Where are sort of the areas where the COP process will need to reform for the future? And we're going to touch on that in a moment. I'm delighted also that we're joined by someone who has real lived experience of the COP process. The Right Honourable Amber Rudd was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate during 2015 to 2016, I think, and she was there at the Paris Agreement and was a critical part of the UK negotiating team, ensuring we had that milestone agreement pass across the line. And thank you, Amber, for coming to give your reflections on the COP process and where you think we may be now and where we think we're going to be heading for the future. So in terms of today, we're going to have a couple of speeches. Both I'll start in a moment, and then we'll have Will then come in with his remarks. Amber will follow, and then we'll open up to some questions before we sort of wrap up at 9 o'clock. But if you do have any points that you'd like to make in that sort of second question answer session, please do raise your hand. Or if not, and you don't want to actually sort of ask your question in person, I'm happy to raise it as the chair. Please do type it into the chat box. The report is now live, as I said, is Lessons from the Past Towards a Better Future, and you'll be able to sort of access that in the chat box. Grace or Max will sort of put the link up very shortly. But in recent years, I think it's fair to say that the annual COP gathering has come under increased scrutiny, in spite of the Paris Agreement I mentioned to reduce emissions by over half the total recorded global CO2 emissions by 1990. That's the commitment that countries have made as part of their national determined contribution. In spite of this, atmospheric CO2 has risen from 354 parts per million in 1990 to 424 parts per million this year. And while we have seen the negotiations driven forwards both success and failure in the past, I think it's important to learn the lessons of those failures to understand how we ensure we have a more certain future ahead of the COP negotiation process. For some, we've seen a narrative take hold that COPs are failing. They're failing to implement the Paris Agreement, failing to fund public climate commitments, and failing to establish proper funding for loss and damage, and failing to garner support for phasing out fossil fuels. And so the criticism we've seen of the COP process ranges either from a desire to boycott the entire thing or to seek to reform the current process, recognizing the progress that has been made so far is too valuable to throw away. And I myself personally fall into that latter camp. We've seen obviously familiar criticisms of the COP process. So we've seen when it comes to looking at this sort of annual gathering that it get the sight of delegates sort of flying from across the globe via aeroplane is an easy target for climate detractors. Emissions at COP26 were estimated to be around 132,000 tons of CO2, which, although it's 2 millionths of global emissions, and regardless of the fact that Glasgow actually, the commitments made during the Glasgow Pact has calculated to reduce emissions by potentially 9.5 billion tonnes by 2030, 72,200 times more than the actual emissions given out at the COP. We still see this as being a potential weakness. At the same time, attendance at COP is coming under increasing questioning. Global Witness have calculated there were 636 fossil fuel lobbyists registered at COP27, which was an increase of 25% from COP26, with more fossil fuel lobbyists than any single national delegation besides the UAE, which registered around 1,000 delegates. So the nature of this international gathering under a fixed time framework, a pressure framework of just under 2 weeks, has also drawn further criticism from what can actually be achieved during that period. Bill Maguire, a professor at UCL, has written that while I would never question the sincerity of those working within the UN COP framework established back in 1992, nor those embedded in the COP climate apparatus, I do, however, seriously wonder whether an annual extravaganza in the full glare of the world's media is the way to do this. In all honesty, it's becoming increasingly difficult to view these events other than photo opportunities for presidents and prime ministers who simply turn up to make the world think they care. Now, I think this COP in particular, COP28, is particularly important in light of the progress we've made since Paris, or the lack of progress. The upcoming global stocktake will tell negotiators, as we have seen from the interim report, that the world is far away from limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And many are already pessimistic about the adequacy of what that political response at COP28 will be. COP28 also represents an important moment for defining what the Paris Agreement has been silent on, namely, how does the global climate community and representatives of the COP process respond to a failure to deliver the required action as set out in national determined contributions, and what will this global stocktake seek to deliver? What shape will it take? Actually, the Paris Agreement is entirely silent on the action that needs to be taken once a global stocktake has been produced. So in a way, while we recognise that the COP processes from 1 to 27 were all about focusing on finalising a fixed agreement, that could be agreed multilaterally, we're now entering this next stage of delivery and implementation, of which we are still in the dark about what this should look like in its entirety. A group of experts, scientists, and policy leaders, including Laurence Toubiana, former climate change ambassador for France, who was intricately involved in the Paris Agreement, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, only recently signed a letter calling on the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and the Executive Secretary of the UN, FCCC, Simon Steele, to reform the COP process so ensure it can deliver results. The key challenge of the letter is that, having secured the necessary commitment through negotiations to deliver, the renewed focus must now be, as I've said, on delivery and implementation with necessary reforms. As the letter states, after 27 COP summits, the negotiation of all essential components of the global climate agreement has been finalised. All efforts must now be focused on one thing, delivery, to enable a safe climate landing for humanity on Earth, and to ensure that the current crises do not delay progress and further exacerbate the disconnect between science and action. Successful delivery, they state, requires a reform of the COP process focused on transforming the COP meetings from closed negotiations of annual statements and accord documents and a legal text to instead becoming a multi-stakeholder platform for delivery, accountability, finance, and exchange of experience and lessons. And Laurence Toubiana, as I mentioned, one of the architects of the Paris Agreement, was explicit in her acknowledgement that COP must reform if it's to remain relevant, stating that the Paris Agreement is central to tackling the climate crisis, but annual summits can't continue with business as usual. The gap between targets and real emissions is dangerously wide. We need to inject new purpose and momentum into COP, or it will lose its relevance at the most critical time. And Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who's the co-president of the Club of Rome, also noted that without rapid and radical transformation, the COP process will fail to deliver a safe climate landing for humanity. We need to choose now to take our foot off the accelerator and to start implementing an emergency plan underpinned by effective future COPs that enable us to emerge from the planetary emergency before us. So in terms of where we might go for the future, this report obviously reflects on the history of COPs 1 to 27, and those histories are a chapter for each COP, setting out not just the context by which the COP took place, but also, as I said, the recommendations that were taken forward, but also the sentiment. As a historian myself, I think it was interesting to reflect on the patterns that you can see that take place at the COP process, the reactions to that. But recognizing that this next stage is now upon us, I think it's really important. And indeed, the UN FCCC Executive Secretary Simon Steele has indicated his own willingness to consider the future reform of the COP process, stating that after COP27, he intended to review the COP process to make it as effective as possible. He stated that what we will be doing when we get back home is to review and to look at areas of improvement, with elements of the process that can be done better, he remarked to the Financial Times. He said the process needs to be as streamlined as possible and it needs to be as effective as possible. And he noted in the article that one potential way to improve the process might be to look at evolving future COP presidencies along the presidency-elect for a given year. And Steele stated, can we work together in creating an expanded agenda? Our view in this paper is that having considered the historical evidence of the COP process, COPs obviously are crucial and pivotal summits. There are, however, important reforms that must be considered to improve the negotiating outcomes and tie better commitments and to implementation and action. So to start with, we recommend moving on from the extravaganza, limiting distractions from the negotiations. So, the pomp and circumstance of COPs are a reflection of the global importance of the climate change debate, and that's incredibly important. But it's also, I think, sort of recognizable that the law of diminishing returns holds strong. COPs reached an inflection point long ago, and since then, the disadvantages of large COPs have begun to outweigh the advantages. So when it comes to world leaders' presence at COPs, for example, no one will deny the importance of climate action being discussed at the highest level, not least among world leaders. But COP observers have identified that the arrival of world leaders during critical negotiations, often to deliver pre-prepared statements and not partake in negotiations, actually is a distraction for negotiators. Everyone suddenly pivots towards the world leaders, which actually stalls negotiations and distracts delegates. So actually, observers have suggested that world leaders' statements and discussions probably merit their own event, perhaps suggesting a world leaders summit after streamlined COPs would be more productive rather than sort of coming along during the first couple of days, when leaders gather. Then there's secondly the role of the UN FCCC. One of the prominent root causes of negotiation inefficiencies is the ever-increasing number of agenda items, many of which overlap significantly. Given almost every single COP has been time constrained, and I think we've seen a pattern also of COPs going 1-2 days past the wire, there's merits in suggesting ultimately that negotiations would benefit from streamlined agendas that are limited to core priorities. There's a role, I believe, for the UN FCCC to step in and improve agenda setting standards from which then the COP presidencies can operate within that sort of confined, fixed term process. And when it comes to COP presidencies themselves, the scale of COPs have made hosting such summits completely inaccessible for a majority of countries. I remember when I was energy minister bidding for COP, and we obviously behind the scenes were ringing up countries, trying to get their sort of commitment. But part of that was to make sure you had a minimum of 30,000 hotel rooms in a city, and also you recognised that the actual cost for hosting a COP was going to come in at £200 million as a minimum, and it's simply not feasible for many countries to make that level of commitment. So, while it may appear that the choice of country, seems arbitrary, actually, we're limiting the ability to actually host a COP to a finite number of countries. And over a cycle of many COPs, the concentration of these presidencies in a fixed number of countries, it simply doesn't help those countries that are most exposed to climate risks. So if we were able to streamline COP, to reduce the numbers participating, to draw in key negotiators, this would allow a more equitable process for more countries potentially to participate in hosting a COP. Then it comes to the issue of corporates and civil society. As I mentioned, the issue around passes, but modern COPs draw many more attendees now from corporates, NGOs, civil societies than they actually do country delegates. And these participants are increasingly essential in the global climate change debates. The momentum and above all technical expertise from private sector participants has been hugely influential on negotiations in recent COPs. Equally, civil society representation voices marginalized community perspective and presents frontline realities. So the greatest impact, though, is achieved on own country engagement with corporates and civil society in anticipation of the COPs, rather the summit themselves, when negotiators are locked away and rarely interface with these observers. So we should learn the lessons of COP26, that actually the presidency spent over a year testing its proposed agenda and priorities from the private sector and civil society. And that long time frame of work enabled a live and dynamic conversation between diplomats and their home country, corporates and civil society, which could feed into the COP preparation. So there is a really important piece here around establishing a framework for actually, when you take up the presidency of a COP, what are the roles and responsibilities right from the start. And I think we've seen, when it comes to what defines a successful COP versus a less successful COP, I wouldn't necessarily call it the COP of failure, it's been that level of engagement. And if countries have made their preparation and taken forward that sense of understanding how to bring together, to shape an agenda and demonstrated climate leadership from the outset, that often leads to more successful outcomes at the COP itself. When it comes to COP28, specifically when it comes to the global stocktake, we have a really important moment to set an effective precedent. The final stage of the global stocktake will be the publication of results at COP28. However, as I said before, the Paris Agreement doesn't indicate how countries ought to respond to this assessment, and COP28 must set an adequate precedent how to respond politically to an assessment of underperformance versus the Paris Agreement's ambition to limit warming. So suggestions on this that we've made in the report include allocating sufficient agenda time to hearing full political responses from delegates, assessing results in the context of the last implementation COP, and identifying gaps in implementation efforts so far, setting the expectation that countries update their NDCs following the COP to catch up with the science, and employing the findings to identify country by country inconsistencies with messaging during negotiations, crucial for ensuring that COPs tie ambition and action together. And finally, delivering a clear message to delegates there is a devolved responsibility on their countries to achieve their NDCs, and that domestic policy should be adjusted to account for the underperformance. I think there's a real important point here around also balancing devolution with accountability, because the main trade-off from devolving emissions reduction to target setting from COP negotiating arena to nation states is a loss of accountability. Most countries are not aligning their stated policies with their committed NDCs. The latest analysis from the International Energy Agency states that policies will more than 10% underperform their NDCs in 2030, generating in excess of 0.7 gigatons of carbon emissions. And that is undermining trust in the COP process and the commitments that are made there. So looking again at effective commitment mechanisms as part of the global stocktake at COPs would provide a counterbalance to the unpredictable and unreliable domestic political environments that policymakers contend with. I think it's also important that when it comes to progress reporting, this needs to be accessible. To support accountability, the Secretariat of COP should make sufficient pre-COP preparations to ensure that the data is comparable, digestible, because this is a huge hurdle to negotiations, which has been the mammoth and opaque way in which reports are presented to time-pressed negotiators. So if we could have a real-time tracker through an online platform, this would also democratize the COP process, and there would be nowhere to hide and it would ensure that we could sort of fast track some of the abilities to make sure that we could hold countries to account. We should also designate interim COPs as accountability summits. So the merit of having this 5-year COP cycle is that different COPs funnel finite political momentum and negotiated energy behind specific elements of the climate action cycle. But while raising ambition levels is vital, unless we focus parties' attention on progress today, enforcing rules and supporting and renewing the implementation of those falling behind, this must be a critical part of the next stages. So when it comes to COP29, for example, we can't just have this be a sort of go slow moment. We need to have set out what is going to happen at COP29. This sort of ratchet mechanism around a 5-year cycle was welcome at Paris, but potentially it is now out of date when it comes to the real term challenge we are facing around emissions and falling behind. Because countries need more support every COP rather than waiting every 5 years. And then I think another point that we'd like to make in conclusion is holding the presidency to account. The counterpoint to party by party accountability is also the accountability of the host nation. COP presidencies' roles go far beyond the physical hosting of the summit. As I said, requires preparatory work. But the host party officially starts its year-long presidency on the first day of the summit. So post-COP efforts, often requiring ambition and commitments to action, are equally critical. So what seems to happen is that we'll have the sort of the establishment of the new presidency, and then everyone will assume that sort of presidency will really kick into action at the COP in a year's time. But no, it should be the COP presidency is a 12-month process, of which every month is absolutely vital. So this role, I think, appears to be underappreciated, and many COP presidencies have been under-resourced as a result. So one simple recommendation would be which would no means solve the issue, would be to prescribe a timetable for the year preceding and the year following a COP, ensuring work keeps pace. And this could specify minimum resourcing levels as well. I'd also like to add a point around a wider agenda on the environment. We saw that nature has been increasingly a feature of climate COPs, but UN biodiversity summits have remained a separate affair, obviously the last being successful COP15 in Montreal last year, which unlocked a global deal on biodiversity. However, if we could look to bring these COPs together, I recognise that this is no easy task, but to enforce the notion that these issues are inextricably linked, you can't tackle one without the other, I think is incredibly important, and that we should seek to bring these COPs together in a single COP process. Overall, the recommendations we've made in this report, as well as the history that's set out, reflect on our own conclusions that when it comes to looking at the COP process, COPs are too valuable to throw away. They are international agreements that countries that sign up to negotiations in a form of a legal text then see that sort of legal process being signed into their own domestic law. And that is absolutely sort of vital that we have that flexibility in place to meet some of the challenges that we face at every COP. But COP28 does mark this inflection point. It does see a moment in the sand whether we move on, not just from Paris, but how we see to deliver and implement. And it's absolutely vital that we look to reform the COP process in order to achieve that. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand over to Will Farrell, my co-author, to give his reflections as well. Will, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And it's been a pleasure to work with you on this. So I'm looking forward to seeing people's reactions. To consider how to shift the needle on COP progress, I wanted to start by reflecting on the particular and often underappreciated complexity of climate change, actually, as a diplomatic issue, but also as a tragedy of the commons, which is so often unfairly compared to the case of ozone depletion. The process of summarizing this history of the COPs reminded us that the intrinsic complexity of climate change seen through the overrunning agendas at most COPs, the multi-stakeholder negotiations, and the incremental and slow progress made. We believe it is important then to fully appreciate this complexity to be able to pragmatically build on the value of past COPs. So let's start with briefly looking back on ozone depletion, a case study for the great potential of global action for solving an environmental dilemma. In the 1970s, it became clear to scientists that CFCs were depleting the ozone layer, a crucial protective layer in our atmosphere. Its depletion was directly increasing the incidence of cataracts and skin cancer. And as an atmospheric issue, its impacts were also felt beyond the borders of the countries emitting CFCs. It took education from the scientific community to generate public and political understanding. It required regulation and investment to solve, including outlawing harmful chemicals and innovating on alternatives that achieve the same product qualities. This all sounds a lot like the carbon and methane problem, i.e. climate change. But while the global community responded quickly to the ozone science, with the 1987 Montreal Protocol committing both developed and developing countries to phasing out ozone-depleting substances, the climate debate rages on. We've made progress, but there's a way to go to secure 1.5 degrees. Many contrast this image of multilateral success and the repair of the ozone with the protracted 3 decades of strenuous and politically fraught COPs. What went so wrong? Well, I don't believe actually much did go wrong. What this history of the COP shows is that the feat of diplomatically generating global action on climate is much more challenging than the response to ozone depletion was, as much as the ozone case study is an interesting and instrumental one. For one, CFCs have never been a primary economic growth driver, and it's important to remember that fossil fuels very much have been. While some consumer goods like fridges had to adapt to CFC regulations, the repercussions were not as wide-sweeping as carbon is ubiquitous in every good and service that we produce. This makes imagining a net zero future incredibly challenging, and why many economic decarbonization scenarios employed by economists are labeled as system transformation scenarios. We must see the development and deployment of myriad technologies, regulations, and circular practices across every aspect of every value chain to transition to net zero. And COPs must somehow build consensus on a world outlook that tackles this complexity head on. It's understandable then that it took policymakers 2 decades to even be able to imagine this and start to precipitate this future reality via the submission of net zero targets, accelerated by the race to submission of NDCs in the run-up to COP26. This timeline of a tragedy of the commons is also material for how motivated policymakers are to respond. Ozone depletion was clearly and significantly impacting individuals as early as the 1980s. The risks concerned, the remedial actions taken, and the benefits were contemporaneous. While we should be grateful that we haven't yet experienced the extreme climate change possible under higher temperature scenarios, the lag between action and consequence inherent to the greenhouse gas effect means that policymakers have significantly discounted the future costs of today's action. It appears too expensive to act now when the status quo can apparently continue for a few years without direct consequence. This explains why much of the climate debate has centered on how to discount future costs, how to get confident about future climate projections, and how to straddle possible generational divides. COPs have largely been an education process, where negotiators have incrementally built consensus on these issues. First, on the real costs of inaction and how the science is unequivocal on the significant probability of extreme economic risks if we don't act. And then COPs have had to agree on how that actually translated into action. This initially took the form of small steps taken by developed nations to curb the growth in emissions. Think of the Kyoto Protocol. But increasingly, COPs have engineered the stepping up of ambition to match the science. Countries actually started to pledge to cut emissions. Industrializing and developing countries committed to emissions targets, and this all led to the consensus that we should keep warming well below 2 degrees and try really hard to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Protracted COP negotiations, yes, but crucially, these last 3 decades of fractious summits have reduced the expected temperature rises by a number of degrees, and it's important to note that. Following the science is now the accustomed rule, and it wasn't 10 years ago. Finally, the other key difference between the climate and ozone case studies is where the risks and losses associated with an action were felt most. Indeed, for ozone, developed economies felt the immediate hit, and it's easier to sell the economic argument for action when you directly reap the reward of your investment. This contrasts a world system that, by coincidence, generates more climate change-induced extreme weather events in less developed economies, while many industrialized nations have felt insulated from climate risks. This is changing as we see wildfires across North America and Europe, extreme flooding across every continent, and droughts impacting agriculture supply chains globally. But loss and damage has been discussed from the very first few COPs, and as this brief history shows, this shift from developed country action at Kyoto to global emissions action in Paris requires a new response to the equity question, and COP27 finally answered calls for funding with the establishment of a loss and damage fund. But as we heard last night, those negotiations are challenging. So the political will might be there, but we need to still get that across the line. I go through all of this to emphasize the complexity and diversity of the climate change debate across the parties attending the COPs for almost 3 decades. This is important framing for the diplomatic challenges ahead, including at COP28, and importantly puts into context the value in the steady stream of incremental wins observed across this history of the COPs. This optimism is needed for COPs to continue to drive forward concrete action, because as a world, we still sit above a 2-degree warming trajectory. And as Chris rightly said in the introduction, we cannot lose the one valuable tool we have for shifting the needle. Now, looking to COP28, the global stocktake will be the ultimate test of how the UAE and negotiating blocs can muster the lessons from the past and effectively answer the most important question: how do we get back on track? Much of the answer will be in the delivery of NDCs, given lagging national policies in most developed economies. But how this answer will be structured will set precedent for how future COPs answer these now routine global stocktakes, of which we are coming to the end of the first one. A robust response addressing the science head-on, while appreciating nation by nation decarbonisation challenges inherent to this climate tragedy of the commons, would drive immediate action. This further aligns negotiating outcomes with the science, importantly extending one of the principal themes seen across this history of the COPs, and building the credibility needed to fully translate high-level commitments into consistent and robust action.
Thanks, Will. Really appreciate it, and also thank you so much again for your work on the paper. It's been great working with you, and obviously thanks also for your work at COP26, when I know that you were working as an advisor to Alok Sharma, as part of his youth advisory board, and delighted you've maintained your commitment to focusing on the COP process. I'm also delighted to introduce our next speaker, the Right Honourable Amber Rudd, who, as I said, had a driving seat during the Paris Agreement, has been in a place many of us haven't, has that lived experience, and delighted you could join us today, Amber, to share your reflections on the COP process and where we go for the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. And can I start by congratulating you and Will and your team for doing this, because it does set the whole context for where we are in these efforts and how COP has evolved. And I think what you're proposing to me is an evolution, which I do think is an important distinction, because the fact that we have Paris as the baseline, I think, is incredibly valuable. It feels particularly valuable in a world where I don't think you would be able to get a Paris agreement equivalent to what we got in 2015 now. And that's to do with the world disorder, the geopolitical events taking place. I just don't think you'd be able to get the consensus that was so hard fought for and in the end won. So we must cherish the COP setup that we have, while also calling for reform, because I worry that if there's too much criticism of the COP process, and there are lots of reasons to be critical of it, it will end up being disbanded and nothing as effective replaced by it. So I would say tread cautiously with reform, so that you're sure that the next stage is actually going to be an improvement rather than lead a vacuum, which is more difficult for building progress on. My experience in the Paris climate change agreements in 2015 was for me, and for anybody participating in it, pretty extraordinary. The first comment I'd like to make is that there was an extraordinary man who led the UK delegation. His name was Pete Betts, and I'm sure that a lot of people who are on this call will know him. He was a complete force of nature in terms of being both ambitious for getting a climate change agreement that actually stood for something, and brilliant at the diplomatic negotiations. And I'm particularly stressing his name in his role because very sadly he died just a week ago. And we are all lucky that he put so much of his life into participating in this way in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So there are many things that took place in Paris that are now people are questioning whether they are needed in COP. And I think that that is the right thing to do, to question it, because we've come a long way and there are different pushes and pulls to do with addressing climate change that were taking place there. But I have to tell you, some of the things that people are considering as whether they're necessary were very necessary in 2015. First of all, the scale of the diplomacy. The French did an extraordinary job. They had spent about 18 months in the run-up to the Paris COP, making sure that they knew what everybody wanted. We talk about the type of preparation that's necessary ahead of any big global agreement. And boy, was this a big one. And you've always got to try and understand what every counterparty needs and where the groupings are, where the power is, what the influence is. And in my experience, the French did that incredibly well. They, of course, have a very strong foreign office, the Quai d'Orsay, and Laurent Fabius put a lot of himself into this to make sure that it happened. So when we arrived in Paris, for not one meeting, but a kind of 2-week long event, he had done a lot of preparation to understand what people wanted. What you saw when we arrived in Paris was a nervousness because the sort of shadow of Copenhagen, which, let's face it, had failed, was sort of hanging over everybody who was meeting there. And also a kind of enthusiasm and excitement that maybe, just maybe this time, it would work and we would get 194 countries to sign up to it. What you got was groupings. Any diplomatic event has groupings of people, but it's no good in a big international negotiation being one little country against the groupings of African countries or America or China, or in our case, happily then, less happily now, leading the EU delegation as part of the influencers as well. Each groupings had different priorities, and it was the role of the French to try to find the compromise within that. And they would put out a text one day, and then people would come like sort of royal delegations into the inner sanctum where Laurent Fabius was and make their points to him about why this wasn't acceptable, but this was, and we needed a bit more of that. And then they'd swing the other way, and 2 days later, come out with another text until right at the end, the final text began to take shape. Above all, it was a triumph of diplomacy, really led very expertly by the French. And in the final, I think it was only the penultimate text in Paris that went from saying limiting the increase in temperature to 2 degrees to putting 1.5 degrees on the front of the agreement. And that was a big surprise to some people, not to the UK delegation, because we've been working within the EU to make sure that it was more ambitious. And under Pete's leadership, we had very strong links with the Small Islands Group, to whom, of course, increasing climate change was and remains absolutely existential. They had a very good leader of the Marshall Islands, a man who's sadly also dead, Tony de Broom. So the other thing that I would learn from these is to have really expert diplomacy, putting huge effort behind the preparation to any agreement. And then finally, when the agreement came into the hall really to be agreed, and as again, I'm sure everybody here knows, it's done by consent. This huge hall with all the different flags in front of it, where the leaders had been, Prime Minister David Cameron, all the different leaders had been during the past few days. And in our case, that mattered, because it mattered to the delegations to know that what they were doing was what their Prime Minister, President, leader wanted. So don't underestimate the role of your leader up there on the stage saying to the delegations, we need a deal, make sure you get one. So we were all in this hall, the final text was there, and it was going to be voices to make sure that it went through. But of course, nobody wanted to hear the 1 or 2 dissenting voices. And in a hall that big, there were 1 or 2 dissenting voices. And before the moment when the actual agreement came into being agreed and the gavel went down, Nicaragua put up its hand and was literally shouting and waving its flag from the desk to get attention to object. And there was then a huddle, which again, anyone who's been involved in diplomacy will be familiar with, a huddle of the people at the front who were trying to work out how to bring Nicaragua down from its objections to agree. Apparently their objections were based on a capitalist approach to reducing carbon in the atmosphere. And I'm told that the Pope was put on the phone to the red delegate from Nicaragua, and he decided to climb down from his particular objection in order to have an entry to St. Peter's whenever that came. So the final moment mattered. It mattered that everybody was brought in. It mattered that there was a high level of drama. It mattered also that once the gavel went down and the agreement was there, that the army of NGOs who were there also participated in saying, this is what we want. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's good enough for us to build on. Because the other nervousness we had was that we would come to an agreement and there would not be a celebration around it. Instead, we would get criticism from having an agreement that wasn't ambitious enough, but we didn't. So all those parts of the agreement, the 2 weeks, the kind of the forcing mechanism, Chris, that you and Will have talked about in your report, where there was a betting poster up in the UK delegation of what day this would end on. You're right, nobody knows what day it will end on, because if you want to get people to compromise, you have got to have some way of making it slightly uncomfortable for them so they think, this has got to end. I guess I will give on that point. I'm afraid that's just how complicated negotiations work. And by the end, the French were turning off the food. There was very little coffee. There was a slight aroma coming from the loos. It became uncomfortable to be there. And I feel that that was part of their intent to get consensus, to get compromise, and to get the final deal. So I think that Paris had its own challenges, issues, and was not perfect, but was a fantastic platform from which us to work on. And since then, it's quite right that we look at how we evolve the COP, how we change it to meet the changing world, the changing demands, and the way that it has become too much of a jamboree and is getting some criticism. But I would caution about making too many changes that don't leave the core elements in place, which is, I think, is the NDCs, is objecting to business as usual, having the proper stock taking. Let's have changes to the COP process that are visibly improvements, and don't try to do things that politicians will never deliver. Remember, we have to take the politicians with us. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, for those vivid reflections, both on the sort of physicality of the COP as much also as the policy process by which negotiations are drawn to a conclusion. And I think that sort of really recognises the real politicchio and the art of the possible that we've got to be able to keep in mind when taking forwards recommendations for reform.